The smell of antiseptic had become a permanent fixture in Riley Hart's life. The hospital waiting room buzzed with flickering fluorescent lights as her fingers trembled over the estimate printed in bold, $180,000. That was the cost of saving her mother's life. Riley had never felt this small before. Poor, yes, invisible often, but never truly powerless, never so desperate that her thoughts started to slip toward corners of herself she had always kept guarded. Her mother, Grace Hart, had raised her alone on a waitress's wages and quiet optimism, the kind of woman who made birthday cakes from pancake mix and still found reasons to laugh when rent was overdue. But leukemia doesn't care about kindness. And now Grace's only chance was an experimental treatment overseas, one Riley couldn't possibly afford. She clutched the paper tighter, almost willing the numbers to change, as if sheer willpower might erase a few zeros. But no miracle appeared, only the soft shuffle of nurses behind her and the cold silence of the hospital air pressing in on her shoulders. She walked home in the rain that night, her shoes soaked, her breath fogging in the chill, as headlights passed her by without pause, the streetlights above flickering like dying stars. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, not with messages from friends or offers of help, just an old post she had made on a forum days ago, a desperate inquiry under an anonymous name, looking for fast money, no questions asked. Most of the replies were spam, some were worse, but one message stood out. No name, no company, just a simple offer that made her pulse spike in her throat. One night, no expectations, $200,000 in cash. Riley stopped under the awning of a closed shop, blinking through rain and disbelief, her thumbs hovering over the reply field as her heart pounded hard enough to drown out her sense of right and wrong. She typed, "What's the catch?" and waited, part of her hoping there would be no answer, that it would all vanish into the void. The response came instantly, fast and clinical, like a contract, like fate. "He's discreet. You will not be harmed. No questions. You can walk away after. All arrangements confidential. Interested." She stared at the screen for a full minute, her breath shallow, her mind spiraling in 100 directions, none of them safe. But the image of her mother in that hospital bed brought everything else into sharp, cruel focus, and she answered only one word, yes. An address arrived moments later, a mansion outside the city, a specific time, midnight, no other instructions. She called her coworker and borrowed a dress, something simple but clean, touched up her face in the diner's backroom mirror, and tried not to think about what she was doing, tried to remember this wasn't about shame, it was about saving a life. The car that picked her up was black with tinted windows, the driver silent, the air inside too clean, too cold, as they drove past miles of empty highway until trees began to thicken, and the moon disappeared behind a stretch of pines. The estate was surrounded by wrought iron gates and silence, the kind of place that didn't exist on Google Maps, the kind of wealth that could erase its footprints. When the car stopped, the front door opened before she could knock. A man in his 50s, dressed in tailored black, gestured for her to follow, his voice calm and rehearsed as he said, "Mr. Whitlock is waiting." She was led through a corridor of marble and quiet opulence, her heels echoing softly against the polished floors, portraits of unsmiling men lining the walls. And when the doors finally opened into the study, she saw him. Grant Whitlock. He sat in a motorized wheelchair near the fireplace, dressed in dark wool and shadows, his eyes the color of steel after rain, not cruel, but unreadable, not broken, but distant. Riley froze for a moment, unsure if she was more afraid of him or of herself, and when he gestured to the chair across from him, she sat without a word. "No need for introductions," he said, his voice low and level. "I know why you're here." Riley nodded, her hands resting stiffly in her lap, waiting for some instruction, some demand, but none came. "I don't need anything from you," he said. "No performance, no touching, no expectations. I just want 1 hour of your presence, nothing more." She blinked in confusion, unsure if this was part of the test or a trick. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "You will," he answered. He asked her about her life, not rudely, not with any invasive tone, just a quiet curiosity that made her answer in slow pieces. She told him about her mother, her childhood, the jobs she worked, the way dreams fell apart quietly when survival took priority. "I wanted to be a writer," she admitted, "but stories don't pay for groceries." Grant studied the fire for a long moment before replying. "Stories pay," just not the ones you want to tell. Time passed, not slowly but with a kind of strange stillness, and when the hour was over he nodded once. The car is waiting outside. Your hospital bill has already been covered. The money will be wired to you by morning. Riley stared at him, unsure what to say, unsure how to process what just happened. "Why me?" she asked, voice trembling. He didn't look at her, just said quietly, "Because you didn't ask what I looked like, you just asked what the catch was." She stood, stunned, and left without another word. The rain had stopped, but everything still felt wet. The world blurred around the edges, and for a moment, as the car pulled away, she looked back at the house and wondered if she had just imagined him, or if maybe he had been the one imagining her. The silence inside the penthouse was different in the morning, not empty but deliberate, like every object had been placed not for comfort but for control. And Riley felt it the moment she stepped into the threshold again, 5 days after the night that had changed everything and nothing. She had told herself she would never return, not because of shame, but because of confusion, the kind that kept her up at night, wondering if what she had seen in Grant Whitlock's eyes was pity, loneliness, or something she wasn't ready to name. The call had come through the same anonymous number, this time from a soft-voiced assistant, who said Mr. Whitlock required help organizing his private library and had specifically requested her. She had hesitated only long enough to remember her mother's hospital room and the thin line of gratitude wrapped in need before accepting. Now, standing inside the marble foyer again, she realized how much of her memory had blurred the place into myth. The high ceilings, the absence of color, the view of the city like a god's window. It was all real, but it felt like walking into a dream she hadn't meant to revisit. Grant sat in the same wheelchair back to her, facing the window, his silhouette outlined by gray light. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't speak, and yet the air between them seemed to shift, as if acknowledging her presence without words. "You're early," he said finally, voice flat but not unkind. Riley set down the supply box she'd brought, glanced at the bookshelves surrounding them like silent witnesses, and replied without thinking, "Or you're late." There was a pause, and then, shockingly, the corner of his mouth lifted, barely, like a crack in stone. "Which would you prefer?" he asked. "I didn't think it mattered," she said. "Most things don't," he answered, then wheeled himself away without another word, disappearing behind a corner hallway that Riley had not yet explored. She got to work quietly, dusting first, moving through the shelves one by one, the leather-bound spines unfamiliar but expensive-looking, titles that sounded like they were meant to impress rather than be read. It was almost 2 hours before he spoke to her again, and even then it was not in person but from behind her, his voice close enough to startle. "You organize like someone who's never owned more than 5 books." She turned quickly, heart stuttering. "I haven't," she said before she could stop herself. Grant tilted his head, studying her, his eyes unreadable. "Then you're doing fine." He left again, and for the rest of the afternoon he came and went like a shadow, never lingering, never engaging, but always there, watching. Over the next few days the routine began to settle. Riley would arrive in the late afternoons, clean, sort, and sometimes talk, not often, just enough to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. She noticed the smallest things, like how his desk was always perfectly aligned, how he never once asked for help moving anything, how the books in his private collection were all first editions, untouched. But more than anything, she noticed him, the way he seemed detached from the luxury around him, how the wealth looked more like armor than comfort, and how his stillness felt like something chosen, not inflicted. But afternoon, after she'd finished wiping down a row of shelves, she found him in the sunroom, staring out at the skyline with a blank expression. She approached slowly, unsure why her chest felt tight. "Do you ever go outside?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "Not unless I want to be reminded what people see when they look at me." Riley frowned. "And what do they see?" she asked. He turned his head, finally meeting her gaze. "A man who lost something and never got it back." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the nearest book, sat across from him, and began to read aloud, her voice quiet but steady, not asking permission, not waiting for approval. He didn't stop her. From that day on, it became a ritual. Riley read to him for an hour each visit, choosing different stories, sometimes fiction, sometimes poetry, and Grant listened, always silent, his expression unchanged, but his attention never strayed. She started to wonder if he had asked her back not for cleaning or help, but because silence had become too heavy to carry alone. Still, he never touched her, never even moved closer than necessary, and yet there was something in the air between them, a weight that grew with every passing day. Then came the night everything cracked. She had stayed late to finish a section of rare manuscripts he kept locked behind glass, and when she realized she'd left her bag near the hallway leading to the east wing, she doubled back, not expecting to hear music, soft and classical, drifting from behind a partially closed door. She approached quietly, and what she saw made her blood freeze. Grant Whitlock was standing, not just standing, but moving, perfectly balanced, stretching, sweat running down his back as he trained with focused precision. No chair, no limb, no sign of disability, she gasped before she could stop it, and he turned, eyes wide with something that wasn't fear or guilt, but resolve. "Riley," he said, his voice sharp but calm. "You weren't supposed to see this." She backed away, heart racing, confusion crashing over her like a wave. "You lied. You've been pretending this whole time." Grant stepped forward, no hesitation in his stride, every movement smooth, controlled, powerful. "Yes, I have," he said, "and I didn't expect you to understand." "Understand what?" she demanded. "That you played me, used my desperation to entertain yourself." But even as she said it, part of her didn't believe it, because the man in front of her didn't look smug, didn't look cruel. He looked exposed. "I don't need your forgiveness," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I do need you to know. I never lied to hurt you. I lied to survive." Riley stared at him, breath shallow, a dozen questions rising in her chest, but all she could say was, "Then why me?" His answer came after a long pause. "Because you didn't flinch when you saw the wheelchair, because you spoke to me like I was still a man, and because I wanted to know what it felt like to be seen by someone who had nothing to gain." She didn't respond, just turned and walked away, the door clicking softly behind her, leaving him standing alone, not in weakness, but in something far more dangerous. The next morning, Riley could not stop replaying the image in her head. The way Grant Whitlock stood in the soft glow of that hidden room, his body strong, movements exact. Nothing like the fragile illusion he had allowed her to believe. She felt foolish, not because he had deceived her, but because she had believed so completely, because something inside her had begun to care about a man she thought she understood, a man in a chair who listened with quiet reverence as she read stories to fill the space between them, a man who asked nothing but presence and gave in return the rarest thing, attention. Now all of it felt like a stage, and she the naive audience. She didn't go to the penthouse that day, nor the next. She ignored the assistant's calls, ignored the quiet pings from the encrypted number that once felt mysterious, but now felt suffocating. She returned to her shift at the diner and tried to forget, but the memory stuck like splinters, not because of what she saw, but because of how much she had begun to hope. 3 days later, she found an envelope taped to her apartment door. Inside was a single page, handwritten, no apology, no excuses. Just his words. "The chair was my way to disappear. You were the first thing I didn't want to hide from. If you want the truth, come back and ask. I'll tell you everything." Her fingers trembled as she held the note. She could have thrown it away, could have told herself he was another rich man playing games with people beneath him. But she didn't, because despite everything, part of her still believed he wasn't pretending when he looked at her like she mattered. That evening, she took the train, the city moving past her like noise, her heart beating louder than the subway tracks. When the elevator opened at the top floor, the penthouse was quiet. He was waiting. No chair this time. He stood near the window, back straight, expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked without preamble. "Why fake a disability? Why lie?" He didn't flinch. "Because when people think you are weak, they speak more honestly. When they think you're broken, they underestimate you. It's the only way I could rebuild what was taken from me." "What was taken?" she asked, and his jaw tightened. "Everything," he said. "My company, my father's name, my future." He walked past her, slow, not hesitant but deliberate, each step a silent confession. 8 years ago, I trusted the wrong man, a board member. He embezzled millions, crashed the company stock, and left me to take the fall. The press tore me apart. The lawsuits buried me. I lost everything, so I vanished. Let them believe I was ruined. Let them think I couldn't fight back. Riley stared at him, the pieces forming faster than she could process. You disappeared into a wheelchair, she said. I disappeared into silence, he corrected. The chair was just part of it. It gave me the cover I needed to work in the shadows, to buy back my company through silent partners, to watch those who betrayed me beg for favors without realizing who they were begging. So this was revenge, she asked. At first, he admitted. But then I met you. She didn't speak. He stepped closer. I never meant to involve you, but you were different. You weren't impressed by the money. You weren't afraid of the silence. You sat in this room and read to me like I was human, not a profile, not a name. And for the first time in years, I wanted to tell the truth. But you didn't, she said. You let me think you were something you're not. No, he said. I let you see the part of me I'd buried. She looked away, arms crossed, her voice low. You don't get to use me as your redemption story. He stepped back, eyes heavy. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know the truth before you walk away. She turned to leave, her hand on the door, but paused. You said I could ask anything. One question. He nodded. Was I just another test? She asked. A way to see if you could still control a narrative? His answer came soft but unwavering. You were the first thing I didn't want to control. She left without another word, heart pounding harder than it had in years, not from fear, but from something else. Recognition. Riley did not return to the penthouse for over a week. Each day she told herself she was done with Grant Whitlock, with his games, with the carefully constructed world he built on secrets and shadows. She poured herself into double shifts at the diner, helped her mother through chemo appointments, and ignored the ache that settled in her chest at night when the city got quiet. But the truth had a way of haunting her. It wasn't just about the lie, it was about how it made her question everything that had felt real. The conversations, the quiet listening, the way he had looked at her like she was not just seen but known. It was easier to stay angry, easier to pretend none of it had mattered. But some truths refused to stay buried. One night, as she walked home from work, she saw him, not in a car or a suit, not in the safety of the penthouse, but standing under the awning of the corner bookstore. No wheelchair, no disguise, just a man waiting. The street lights flickered overhead, and the city moved around them, unaware. Riley froze. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her with eyes that seemed far less guarded than before. You left, he said. She nodded. You lied. Yes, he replied. But not about everything. She crossed her arms. So which part was real? His voice came without hesitation. The part where I started needing to see you, even when I knew I shouldn't. That was what broke her stillness, not the words, but the honesty in them. She didn't move toward him, but she didn't walk away, either. What do you want from me now? She asked. Nothing, he said. That's why I'm here. I needed you to see that I'm still standing, and I'm not asking you to fix or forgive me. I just wanted to see you again, outside of all that noise. Riley didn't know what to say. She had spent the last week convincing herself that whatever they had was nothing, a trick of proximity and loneliness. But now, face to face again, she saw the man who had sat and listened to her read, who had offered her silence instead of seduction, who had looked at her not like a mistake, but like an answer. You don't make things easy, she said. I never learned how, he replied. That made her smile, just barely, and she hated that he noticed. Come with me, she said suddenly, surprising even herself. He blinked. Where? Somewhere not made of marble, she said. They walked in silence to the subway station, people brushing past them, nobody noticing the billionaire in worn boots beside the waitress in second-hand jeans. She took him to the diner where she worked, empty now, the chairs stacked except for one booth in the corner. She poured them both coffee and sat across from him, the fluorescent lights humming above. This is where I live, she said. Not the diner, but this life. Tight shoes, tired eyes, and tips that barely make rent. You wanted to disappear into a wheelchair? I disappear behind a smile. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty comforts. He just listened. I never hated you for lying, she continued. I hated that I started trusting you right before you gave me a reason not to. Then let me give you a reason to start again, he said, not as the man in the chair, not as the billionaire, just as Grant. She stared at him, wondering how someone so complicated could make things sound so simple. You keep saying that like it's easy. It's not, he said, but it's the only thing I haven't tried. She finished her coffee, watching him over the rim of the cup. If I give you a chance, it's not because I trust you again, she said. It's because I want to see if you can earn it. He nodded. That's more than I deserve. Yeah, she said. But you're getting it anyway. They didn't kiss, didn't touch, just sat across from each other while the neon signs flickered outside and the city kept breathing. It was the most honest moment they had shared, stripped of power, status, or expectations, just two people who had both learned to survive by hiding, now trying to figure out what it meant to be seen. The next few days unfolded slowly and without promise. Riley didn't return to the penthouse, and Grant didn't call, not because they were avoiding each other, but because something delicate had formed between them, something neither of them knew how to name yet. It was not a relationship, not forgiveness, not even hope. It was something smaller and far more fragile, a willingness to try again without knowing where it would lead. Riley found herself thinking about him during quiet moments, when the diner slowed and the city lights spilled across greasy countertops. She thought about the way he had stood at that bookstore, stripped of power and pretense, just a man waiting, not asking for anything, and somehow that stayed with her more than all the nights in his mansion ever had. One evening, after her shift, she walked without thinking, past her stop, past her street, until she found herself standing in front of the building she had sworn not to enter again unless she was ready. The doorman didn't question her this time, only nodded. And when the elevator doors opened, she hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping inside. The numbers ticked up slowly, floor by floor, until she stood once more in the silent hall of wealth and stone. Grant opened the door before she knocked, as if he had known she would come, and for a few long seconds neither of them spoke, the air between them charged but calm. She stepped inside without a word, and he followed, the living room unchanged, the skyline as breathtaking as ever. But something had shifted, not in the room, but in them. He didn't lead her to a seat, didn't offer her tea or wine. He simply stood beside her in the silence, and for once, she wasn't afraid of it. I don't know what this is, she said finally, voice low but steady, but I'm tired of pretending it didn't matter. Grant nodded once, his hands in his pockets, the lines around his eyes softer than she remembered. You mattered before I knew your name, he said. And it didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like confession. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her fingers tracing the seam in the cushion, a nervous habit. He watched her for a moment, then joined her, not close, not touching, just near enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. Why did you really choose me that first night? She asked. Was it just because I didn't ask what you looked like? He shook his head slowly. Because you asked what the catch was, he said. Everyone else just wanted the money, the fantasy. You wanted to survive without losing yourself, and I recognized that. Her voice dropped. I thought I was selling a piece of myself that night. I thought I was making a trade I'd regret forever, but I left with something I didn't expect, a story I couldn't stop thinking about. You left with your dignity, he said, and I was the one who couldn't stop thinking. They sat for a while longer, the city humming beneath them like a pulse, and then, slowly, she turned toward him. I'm not good at this, she said. I've never had something that didn't come with a price. I don't want to own you, he said. I just want to be where you feel safe being exactly who you are. She reached for his hand, not dramatically, just enough for their fingers to meet, and when he didn't pull away, she held on, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. That night, she didn't stay over, didn't fall into his bed or his arms. Instead, she left quietly, her coat wrapped tight around her, her heart steadier than it had been in weeks, because she understood now. What they were building wasn't a rescue or a romance. It was trust, and that would take more than a single night. Over the following weeks, their rhythm returned, but it was different, softer, more grounded. Riley still worked her shifts, still helped her mother, still lived in her cramped apartment, but now there was a space in her week reserved for late conversations in Grant's kitchen, shared silence over tea, and the unspoken comfort of presence. He showed her parts of himself no one else had seen, sketches of old product designs from when he still believed in ideas, not markets, recordings of his father's speeches before the collapse, photos of a boy who used to smile more, and she, in return, showed him her drawings, rough and hesitant at first, then bolder, stories scribbled in the margins, tiny pieces of the life she had buried under responsibility. Grant had a habit of asking quiet questions at the most unexpected times, like what color she dreamed in, or what she would do if fear didn't matter, and she surprised herself with the answers, not because she didn't know them, but because no one had ever cared to ask. Still, nothing physical passed between them, no kisses, no promises, but the emotional closeness deepened, and it terrified her more than anything else ever had. One evening, he invited her to a rooftop dinner, just the two of them, candles flickering against the skyline, the table set with care, not opulence. She wore a simple black dress, the same one from the first night, and he, for the first time, looked nervous. "I didn't bring you here to impress you," he said. "I brought you here because I don't know how else to say that this matters to me more than I know how to handle." She looked out at the city, then back at him. "Then let's stop handling it," she said, "and just let it be real." He reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't just hold it, she leaned into his shoulder, the tension slowly melting into quiet. There was no music, no speech, no sudden declarations, only two people who had unlearned how to trust, slowly finding their way back to it. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm neither of them defined but both understood. Grant continued his work quietly, meetings behind closed doors and strategy papers spread across marble countertops, while Riley moved between shifts at the diner and hospital visits with her mother. But every other evening she returned to the penthouse, not as a guest, and not quite as something more, but as a presence that made the cold walls feel slightly warmer. The hours they shared were not grand or eventful, yet each one deepened something between them that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. They didn't speak in declarations or fall into passion. Instead, they learned the shape of each other's silence, the rhythms of breath that filled the spaces between words, and it was in those quiet places that something real began to form, something patient and unspoken, and undeniably growing. One night, as the city rain tapped gently against the tall windows, Riley found herself curled on the floor near the fireplace, sketchbook in her lap, while Grant sat nearby reading, the kind of night where nothing needed to happen because everything already was. She had stopped questioning the peace she found in his presence, had stopped needing to label what they were, but when she caught him watching her over the edge of his book with a gaze not full of hunger but of reverence, her breath caught, not because she was afraid, but because she was seen again, fully and without judgment. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, not looking up. "The chair, the mask, the distance." Grant closed the book slowly and answered after a beat. "Sometimes. Pretending was easier than healing." Riley nodded, understanding that too well. "But healing is the only thing that lets you move forward," she said quietly, "even if it's slow and messy." He studied her face, then said, "I used to think vulnerability was weakness, that letting someone see the broken parts would make me easier to hurt. And now?" she asked. "Now? I think hiding them made me lonelier," he admitted. She met his eyes then, and for the first time in weeks, she reached out and touched his wrist, light and brief, a gesture that said, "I see you too." The next evening she brought her mother's soup to reheat in his kitchen, and they ate together in mismatched bowls like two people who had lived separate storms and were now sitting in the calm between them. She told him stories of growing up in a one-bedroom apartment with leaking ceilings, and laughter that tried to cover hunger, while he told her about the night he realized he'd been chasing revenge longer than he'd been chasing joy. They didn't cry, didn't console, just listened, and that was enough. It wasn't until the third week after their rooftop dinner that something shifted again, not in words or gestures, but in the way Riley began to leave parts of herself behind. A book she was reading left on the couch, a sketch pinned to the fridge, socks tucked under the edge of the couch, and Grant didn't remove them, didn't clean up after her. He let them stay, as if her presence had started to rewrite the definition of his home. It felt like the beginning of something permanent, something that neither of them had said aloud. But the world outside did not wait, and the day arrived when her mother's hospital bills piled higher than expected, insurance delays and pharmacy shortages pushing Riley back into long shifts, overtime and exhaustion that clawed at the edges of her calm. She started arriving later to the penthouse, sometimes not at all. Grant didn't pressure her, didn't demand answers, only watched quietly as the circles under her eyes deepened and her shoulders tensed like armor. One night she collapsed on his couch without a word, her hands shaking from too much coffee and too little rest. He sat beside her and offered nothing but presence, and that was what finally broke the dam. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "To need someone and not feel weak." Grant's hand found hers, strong and steady. "You're not weak for needing help," he said. "You're strong for still standing." She didn't cry, but the silence between them felt heavier than words, and when he pulled her into an embrace, it wasn't romantic, it was grounding, like anchoring a storm. That night she stayed, not in his bed, not because of passion, but because she couldn't walk home. Because she was tired and safe and needed quiet more than anything else. He gave her a blanket and a pillow and let her sleep on the couch, with the city lights flickering above like distant stars. And when she woke in the morning to find a fresh pot of coffee and a note beside it that simply said, "You don't have to do this alone," she didn't question whether he meant it. She knew. As spring crept into the city and the light shifted in the windows, something began to bloom between them, still unspoken, still fragile but undeniable. And when Riley's mother was finally approved for a new treatment, and the hospital called with better news than expected, the first person she wanted to tell was Grant. Not because he could solve it, but because he would understand why it mattered. She rushed to the penthouse, breathless, and when he opened the door, she didn't say a word, just threw her arms around him and held on. He didn't ask what happened, didn't press. He only wrapped his arms around her like he had been waiting for that moment since the day they met. And when she finally pulled back and smiled through damp eyes, she whispered, "We got a little more time," and that was all he needed to hear. As the city warmed and the days stretched longer, the space between Riley and Grant began to narrow in ways that neither fully acknowledged, but both felt deeply. It was in the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, in the way his gaze lingered a second too long on her hand resting on the table. They were building something unspoken, layer by layer, a connection born not of urgency or desire, but of something steadier, something earned. Riley continued splitting her time between the diner and the hospital, still running on fumes, but now she had somewhere to rest at the end of the day, even if she didn't call it home. Grant never asked her to move in, never suggested permanence, but the penthouse changed in subtle ways. Her shoes by the door, a toothbrush in the guest bathroom, coffee mugs left in the sink without apology. One evening, as she sketched at the kitchen counter, Grant sat across from her reading a file, and she caught him watching her from the corner of his eye. "What?" she asked, not looking up. "Nothing," he said, "just wondering what you see when you look at me." She didn't answer right away, shading the curve of a shoulder in her drawing. Then she glanced up and said quietly, "Someone who doesn't want to be saved, but deserves to be." His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak, just folded the file and set it aside. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, he lifted the pages one by one, studying the drawings she hadn't shown him yet, small portraits of hands, eyes, rooftops, and in the corner of one page, a simple sketch of him, not seated, not powerful, just quiet and alone. And beneath it, a single line written in small, careful letters, "A man learning how to stand still." He closed the book and didn't sleep that night. A few days later, Riley received a call from a private number, a woman's voice on the other end, clipped and formal. "Kane, I'm with Whitlock Holdings. I'm afraid we need to speak regarding a matter involving Grant Whitlock." The words chilled her before she even understood why. When she arrived at the office, a sleek tower in Midtown she had never visited before, she was escorted to a private conference room where a stern-faced executive waited. "Are you aware of Mr. Whitlock's financial arrangements regarding your family?" the woman asked without preamble. Riley frowned, confused. "What arrangements?" The woman slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, payment transfers, legal notes, anonymous donations traced back to shell companies. "Mr. Whitlock has been funding your mother's treatments for over 3 months, the woman said flatly, through back channels, undisclosed gifts, and off-record account. Riley felt her stomach twist. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, voice low. "Because the board is concerned," the woman replied, "that his decisions are being influenced by personal relationships which compromise the firm's integrity." Riley stood without responding, heart pounding, hands numb. She left the building in a daze, the city around her a blur, She felt betrayed, not by the act of kindness, but by the silence, by the way he had decided what she needed without ever asking, by the fact that her independence had been quietly underwritten without her knowledge. When she reached the penthouse, Grant was waiting. He rose when he saw her, but paused at her expression. "You knew," she said, and his face tensed. "I wanted to help," he said. "I didn't want it to come between us." "But you didn't ask," she whispered. "You decided for me." He moved toward her, but she stepped back. "I opened up to you. I told you how hard it was to stand on my own, and you went behind my back and took that choice away." "It wasn't about control," he said. "It was about care." "You don't get to care in secret," she snapped. "That's not care. That's manipulation." He stood in silence, and for the first time since they met, Riley saw him not as a man recovering from loss, not as a partner slowly learning to trust, but as someone who still didn't know how to let others carry their own weight. "You think love means protection," she said. "But it doesn't. It means partnership. It means trusting me to fall and get back up." "I was trying to help," he said again, but softer this time, and it sounded like regret. She stared at him, breath shallow. "I need time," she said, and turned before he could respond. That night, she didn't go back to her apartment, didn't go to work. Instead, she walked until the sky turned dark and the streets emptied, trying to sort through the knot of gratitude and anger inside her chest. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message that she was still someone to be saved, still someone whose struggles needed to be handled, and that hurt more than anything else he could have done. When she finally returned to her apartment in the early morning light, she found an envelope under her door, his handwriting on the outside. Inside was not a letter, but a copy of the sketch she had drawn of him, and beneath it, a new line written in his hand, "A man learning how to listen." She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry, because it was the first thing he had given her without trying to fix something. Riley didn't respond to the letter immediately. She kept it tucked between pages of her sketchbook, as if unsure whether it was meant to be read or remembered. She went about her days in a fog of conflicting emotions, one part of her still aching from the sense of betrayal, and another part unwilling to let go of what they had started building. Her mother's health was improving slowly, and the burden on Riley's shoulders lightened just enough for her to feel how deeply tired she really was, not just physically but emotionally, the kind of exhaustion that came from being strong for too long without pause. Every time her phone buzzed with Grant's name, she hesitated, fingers hovering, breath held, but she never pressed answer. Instead, she sketched, more than she had in years, pages filled with images she couldn't speak out loud, hands reaching for hands, eyes that never quite met, walls with cracks running through them, and windows just beginning to open. Each drawing was a confession without words, a conversation she wasn't ready to have. A week passed, then another, and still she didn't return to the penthouse, didn't walk by the bookstore or visit the rooftop they had shared. She needed time to remember who she was without him, to prove to herself that she could stand alone again, not because she didn't want him, but because she didn't want to lose herself in wanting. Then one afternoon, as she walked out of the diner, she saw a black SUV idling at the curb. The window rolled down and Grant leaned out, not in a suit, not behind glass or title, just a man with tired eyes and a quiet question. "Ride with me," he said, and something in his voice made her pause. Not command, not desperation, just hope wrapped in restraint. She got in without speaking. The city slipped by in silence. He didn't reach for her, didn't look at her more than once, only stared out the window, as if afraid too much eye contact might break the fragile bridge between them. He drove them to a place she didn't recognize at first, a brownstone in Brooklyn, old but clean, with ivy curling up the sides and laughter drifting faintly from a backyard. He parked and got out, walked around to open her door, and gestured for her to follow. Confused but curious, she stepped into the quiet hallway and followed him up a narrow staircase until they reached a small studio, the smell of paint and paper and something warm in the air. "What is this?" she asked softly. "A space I bought," he said. "For you." Her heart clenched. "Grant!" "No," he interrupted gently. "Not like that. Not a gift. A choice. If you want it, it's yours. If not, I'll sell it next week. I just needed to show you that I hear you, that I'm not here to fix your life, only to make room for it." She stepped inside slowly, The walls were bare but bright, natural light pouring through tall windows, a corner desk already set up with her favorite sketchbooks, and the pens she always said were too expensive. "I listened," he said again, "to the things you never asked for, and this is what I heard." She turned to face him, unsure whether to yell or cry or kiss him, but instead she said, "Why?" And his answer came without pause. "Because I want to build something with you that isn't built on debt or gratitude or power, just choice." She looked around the studio again, the way the shadows moved on the walls, the quiet promise it held, and she realized he wasn't giving her something, he was offering her a place to begin, on her own terms. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then we walk away," he said, "and I carry nothing but the hope that you'll find what you need." She took a breath, deep and slow, then whispered, "And if I say yes?" He smiled, not wide, but real. "Then we start again, not from scratch, but from truth." That evening, she didn't return to her apartment. She stayed in the studio long after he left, sketching by the window until the stars came out, and when she finally closed the notebook and looked up, she felt something shift inside her. Not the vanishing of pain, but the arrival of possibility. She didn't know if they would make it, didn't know if trust once cracked could truly be whole again. But she knew this time the choice was hers, not forced, not bargained, not bought, and that made all the difference. Over the following weeks, Riley began to visit the studio more often. Not every day and not always for long, but enough for the space to feel like hers. She painted late into the evening, sometimes with jazz humming from an old speaker Grant had left in the corner, sometimes in silence, so complete she could hear the scratch of graphite on paper, as if the world had narrowed to her and the page. She didn't move in, didn't quit her job, didn't uproot the life she had fought so hard to protect. Instead, she let herself grow roots in two places, one still defined by survival, the other now quietly shaped by choice, and Grant respected every boundary she drew. He didn't call unless she called first, didn't visit unless she invited him, and never once asked what she was drawing, though she knew he was curious. It was the absence of pressure that let her trust begin to mend, not all at once and not completely, but enough to let her lean again without flinching. Then one Sunday afternoon, as lights spilled across the studio floor, Riley found herself sketching him, not the man she had met that first night, or the one who had stood in silence as she stormed out of his penthouse, but the one who showed up without answers, who waited outside diners at 2 a.m. without expectations, the one who had offered her space without claiming her story. She finished the drawing in slow, careful lines, a man sitting in a chair that wasn't his wheelchair, head bowed, one hand curled loosely around a coffee mug, and for the first time she added color, not much, just the pale orange of sunrise across his shoulders, and a faint blue where the light touched the edges of his jaw. When it was done, she stared at it for a long time before slipping it into an envelope and walking 3 blocks to where she knew he'd be. Grant answered the door without surprise, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and glasses she had never seen before, his hair slightly tousled like he'd been running a hand through it too often. He stepped aside silently, and she entered the penthouse that once felt like a glass palace and now felt more like a quiet memory. She didn't sit, just placed the envelope on the counter and looked at him. "I'm not here to say I forgive you," she said, "because I think we're past that." He nodded slowly, listening with a stillness she had grown to trust. "I'm here because I want to stop running from what's real," she continued. "Even if it's messy, even if it's slow, I want to try together." He stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate calm he always used when something mattered. "I don't need perfect," he said. "I just need honest." And when she reached for his hand, he didn't hesitate, their fingers laced easily like muscle memory. They didn't rush into anything after that, didn't move in together, didn't announce anything, but they began to live in each other's orbits more fully. Riley spent 3 nights a week at the studio, one at her mother's and the others curled on Grant's couch with her feet tucked under her and a sketch pad balanced on her knees. They cooked together on Thursdays, walked through flea markets on Sundays, and sometimes spent hours saying nothing at all. The world had not stopped demanding things from them. Grant's business still needed attention. Riley's mother still had good days and bad. Bills still arrived and stress still crept in around the edges. But now they faced it with the quiet comfort of knowing they didn't have to face it alone. One evening, Grant took her to a small gallery opening in the East Village, just a local event filled with hopeful artists and free wine. Riley wore a simple navy dress and no makeup, her hair braided back loosely, and when Grant introduced her to a colleague as the most talented person I know, she flushed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. But he didn't say it to impress anyone, didn't follow it with a boast or a sales pitch, just held her gaze like the truth had finally found its way into the open. Later that night, as they walked home beneath streetlights and laughter, Riley stopped and looked up at him. "Do you still think I was the wrong choice?" she asked. His answer came without hesitation. "You were the only real choice I ever made." And then he kissed her. Not the kind of kiss that burns fast and bright, but the kind that settles in your chest and reminds you how to breathe. She kissed him back with all the patience they had built between them, all the trust and fear and quiet that had led to this, and for the first time since their story began, there was no weight left between them, only warmth. The shift came one late afternoon in early spring when the sun hung low and golden over the skyline, and Riley stepped into the studio to find Grant already there. Not waiting, not hovering, just sitting on the floor in front of the window, sketchbook in his lap, pencil in hand, and an expression of such quiet concentration it took her a full minute to speak. When she did, her voice was soft, curious. "You're drawing." He looked up and smiled slightly, a bit sheepish, a bit proud. "Trying, anyway," he said. "Not like you, but I wanted to see what it felt like." She sat beside him, leaning into the warmth spilling across the floor, and peeked at the page. It was a mess, unpracticed lines and uneven shapes. But it wasn't bad. It was honest. She touched the edge of the paper and said quietly, "This means more than anything you've ever bought me." And he didn't need to ask why, because they both knew effort was the one thing no one could fake, the kind of effort that came from showing up. Not from fixing, or saving, or controlling, but from choosing to be present, to try. That evening, as they sat on the floor eating takeout and listening to a playlist Riley had made months earlier, a knock came at the studio door. Unexpected. Firm. She opened it and found a delivery man holding a thick envelope, marked with official seals. It was a legal summons, directed at Grant. She turned, stunned. He looked at the document and exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. She closed the door before asking, "What is it?" And he said calmly, "I think my father's old partner is suing me again." She blinked, stunned, but didn't speak, so he added, "He's been trying to reclaim a stake in the company, using old contracts he claimed were forged. I thought we shut it down, but apparently he's back." She sat beside him on the floor, knees touching. "What does this mean?" He met her gaze. "It means we go to court. It means everything I've built might get dragged through the mud again, and it means he hasn't forgotten me." She studied his face, searching for the fear she expected, but found only tired resolve, and behind it something else. Not fear, but protection. Not for himself, but for her. He turned away, suddenly stood, walked to the window, hands in his pockets, and said without looking back, "You know, if this goes public, they'll come after everyone in my life. Anyone close to me, you included." She stood slowly, crossed the room, and placed a hand on his back. "I'm not afraid," she said, and when he turned to face her, the tension in his shoulders broke slightly. "I'm not used to people staying when it gets ugly," he admitted. She stepped closer and said gently, "Then maybe it's time you stop testing whether they will." In the days that followed, the lawsuit news broke, headlines swirled, articles speculated, rumors churned, and though Grant had prepared for it, nothing could shield him from the weight of being the center of a public storm again. Cameras camped outside his office, reporters called his assistant non-stop, and board members began whispering about stability. And Riley watched it all with a calm she didn't feel. Inside, every instinct told her to run, to retreat into the safe world of anonymity. But something steadier kept her rooted. Her belief in him, in them, in the truth they had built. When a journalist showed up outside the studio shouting questions about their relationship, Grant didn't hide. He stepped out onto the stoop with Riley at his side and said simply, "There is no scandal here. There is no secret. This is the woman I choose to have beside me through everything." She didn't flinch, didn't look away, and the photo taken that day ran on a dozen blogs, her standing tall next to him, not clinging, not hiding, just present. The court date arrived and they walked in together, hand in hand. Riley wore the same blazer she had once borrowed for an interview. Grant wore no tie, just a quiet expression. And when the opposing counsel tried to paint him as manipulative, greedy, cold, Riley sat in the gallery and never looked away. never stopped believing in the version of him she had come to know. The case dragged on for weeks, arguments, depositions, delays, and through it all they grew stronger, not because it was easy, but because they showed up again and again for each other when he came home late with tired eyes. She stayed up when she forgot to eat. From the stress, he brought her food. When the verdict finally came, it was quiet, swift, and in their favor. The judge dismissed the claim, citing lack of evidence, and the headlines turned again, now calling Grant resilient, vindicated, victorious. But neither of them celebrated with champagne or parties. Instead, they returned to the studio, opened the windows, and sat on the floor, again, this time in silence, breathing relief. That night, Grant took her hand, looked at her with a stillness that was anything but empty, and said softly, "Thank you. Not just for staying, but for seeing me through this." Her fingers tightened around his, and she replied, "You didn't need saving, you just needed someone to believe you were worth standing beside. And I did." And in that moment, with the city stretching wide beyond the glass, and the dust of old ghosts finally settling, something impossible had happened. Not a miracle, not a twist, but the quiet choice to stay. The quiet bravery to trust the impossible had never been his recovery or her resilience. It was the fact that against every reason to protect themselves, they had chosen each other, fully, free.